Good morning. I'm Arlen Hastings, Alan's middle daughter. Thank you all so much for being here or out there to help my sisters and me celebrate our father. You are all invited immediately after the talks to a lunch reception over at the Institute Dining Hall across campus. As a testament to just how widely our father was loved and admired, there are people watching the live stream today from, and I have my cheat sheet here, Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Florida, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington State, and Canada, England, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Japan, Kosovo, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Slovakia, Spain, and Switzerland. Thank you all so much for being part of our father's life. Annie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie. I'm Alan's oldest daughter. I'm wearing his hat and I'm wearing my mom's necklace. Dad could have stayed in a hotel, but no, he wanted to stay with me in my little cabin in the woods. I think he knew it might be his last glimpse of my California life. It was. This is a memory that I will hold on to like a gift, his visit to me that winter of 2019. It was then that I realized that although I'd grown up feeling like the black sheep of the family, Dad really, really loved me, had come to admire my non-traditional lifestyle in ways I never thought he would. This had been my take when I was younger. Daddy knew everything. He knew how to dispel conflicts in faraway places, how to speak Russian. He taught me some Russian swear words that I still remember. And he was a scholar who was pragmatic, brilliant, articulate, and funny. His magical visit in 2019 was one of the rare times I had him to myself. I had no cell phone service, no landline, no TV, and unpredictable Wi-Fi. It was during the impeachment hearings of President Trump, and Dad watched the proceedings as best he could with my limited technology. My cabin had a wood stove, but since Dad was already showing signs of COPD, I used my wimpy propane heater instead. Dad was such a good sport. He came with me to where I kept my horse. He made a movie of me scooping her manure, and we had a spirited conversation about the difference between scooping poop and mucking stalls. Horses were never a part of his life, and there he was, genuinely interested in my horse life, documenting it. But then when I asked him playfully if he wanted to help me clean, his response was a decisive, "No, I don't." He was so sure of himself. Back in my cabin, I showed him my portfolio, and he told me what a great commercial illustrator I could have been if I'd stuck with it. I swelled with pride. I'd always been beyond proud of him. My son, Julian, took his life in 2012 when he was 22. I'd asked Dad to help me scatter Julian's ashes during that visit to my cabin. My son and my dad had been remarkably close. There was a river near my cabin, and Dad walked the short distance gingerly because it was hilly and there were rocks and he had peripheral neuropathy. But he made the walk without complaining, pried the lid off the sealed brass box that held my son's remains, then filmed me while I tossed chunky ashes into the quiet river, brushing my tears away. He was so kind. I expect I'll always remember the feeling of peace and connection and support and the ease of conversation coupled with companionable silences during that visit. He also took me and two of my girlfriends out to a delightful little restaurant in the boonies and regaled them with tales of his foreign adventures. He was so charming. My last trip to see him on the East Coast was when he was at home, bedridden. I hadn't healed properly from a major surgery several months prior, and my legs were numb and weak. When I got to Princeton, I walked as best as I could to Dad's hospital bed. He weighed about 135 pounds, but he looked as handsome and dignified as ever. I bent down close because he was trying to say something. By that time, he was eating little more than ice chips and sometimes wincing in pain or speaking delusionally and would die a few days later. I felt his breath on my cheek when he whispered with effort, "How are your legs?" He was so caring. I'm grateful to say there was no unfinished business between me and my dad when he died. I ache with the absence of him. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Josh Neiman. I am one of the son-in-laws. In his remarks at Trudy's memorial, Alan spoke of their deep love that was unburdened by the baggage that often accompanies a life together. I can say happily that I too had a baggage-free relationship with Alan. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and I rarely saw my father, so did not have any meaningful relationship with him. In every way, Alan was the father I never had, but it was unfraught and lacked the tension that often saddles so many parent-child relationships. I never felt I had to prove myself to him to gain his approval. He accepted me for who I am, loud, highly opinionated, loquacious. I could go on. I've come to realize that he was indeed accepting of everyone. He had an uncanny knack of meeting people where they were and engaging them in the way that they wanted to engage, whether that meant insightful conversations about the geopolitical implications of you name the topic, or simply sitting in quiet contemplative thought. But he seldom gave advice, even when you wanted it. Perhaps this is what made him so successful in his career. There are many words I can use to describe him: a rock, rational, sometimes to a fault, a father, a jokester, I'll get to that one later, and a friend. Maintaining friendships was of paramount importance to him, and he worked hard to nurture friendships across the globe, as evidenced by Arlen's scroll of people and where they were from. And he cared deeply about those people's lives, their family, their own burdens, and their own health. I remember as he was dying and starting to fade, Annie and I both had serious health issues. She spoke of hers. I'll share my own. About 6 weeks before he died, I had to have emergency spinal surgery. Not only did he constantly check in to see how I was doing, but he also expressed his deep regret that he could not come to Baltimore to help as he had done just a few years prior when I'd had another surgery. In many ways, our well-being was more important to him than his own. At least that's how he made me feel. He had a wonderful perspective on all matters. A favorite story was one he told of his own father. We all know that Alan grew up on a chicken farm, a Depression-era baby without a lot of money. His father, Mersch, had just bought an electric razor, of which he was very proud. Alan proceeded to drop it and break it into 1,000 pieces. Mersch's reaction? Laughter. I suspect Alan repeatedly told me this story because I tend to overreact in situations like that. And he wanted me to realize that it just doesn't matter. As I get older, I try, too often unsuccessfully, to adopt that perspective. He was a wonderful grandfather who loved all 6 of his grandchildren and was proud of their accomplishments. I know this may sound crazy, but I will forever be grateful that he taught my children to curse, both in English and Russian. You can talk to Sophie and Daniel about that later if you choose. Last paragraph always. There's no way that I can list all the things that I miss about Big Al, but his sense of humor tops the list. He had a joke for everything, most of them inappropriate. Don't worry, Anita, I won't tell one. What was amazing was his ability to recall the right joke for the right circumstance on the spot. I have no doubt that somewhere in that brain of his would have been a joke about being eulogized. I would give anything in the world to be sitting at the table at 949 and hear him tell it. I love you, Pops.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm Alan's granddaughter. One moment. As a toddler, I was deeply afraid, sometimes to the point of tears, of Grandpa's scratchy voice. It is a good thing that I got over that fear quickly. Getting over it meant that I could listen to his stories. These began with invented yarns about the River Queen. I would sit on his knee, and he would spin tales about a miniature ship from the mantle that grew to full size when it touched water. There were also stories about growing up on the chickens farm in Toms River in New Jersey, where he would spell out dirty words in chicken feed to salute the pilots flying overhead, or pee out the window to avoid crossing the yard to go to the outhouse in the cold. My parents would famously place a dollar on the dashboard and promised me that if I did not ask for a story on the long ride between Baltimore and Princeton to Grandma and Grandpa's house, I could have it. Grandpa never seemed to tire of telling stories. As I got older, his tales became more advanced. There was the time he ate bear meat and drank vodka on the banks of the Moscow River with his female colleagues, famously outdrinking their Soviet counterparts. There was the time he helped a Czechoslovakian dissident, Lev Soldak, and his family flee the country, calling a friend at the American embassy to draw up fake papers before plotting a trip across the Austrian border to disguise the escape. He was an endless well of information. Once, when I was working on an article about a slain Rwandan dissident who'd been awarded the prestigious Václav Havel Prize, named for a famed Czech dissident, Grandpa Big Al mentioned that he'd actually spoken to Havel on several occasions, as casually as he'd mentioned meeting any acquaintance. But he took just as seriously the work of others. He gifted me with my first camera, nurturing first a love of capturing images and later a career in reporting. When I was working in Congo this summer, he texted every single day to check on me. His partner, Trudy, had died in May. I'm wearing her earrings as a tribute to both of them. And in the midst of heartbreak, both metaphorical and literal at the time, he listened intently as I described days spent speaking to people displaced by a volcanic eruption, and then peppered me with sharp and incisive questions about my reporting. When he died in November, I found myself describing traditions with Grandpa and at the house in Princeton in the present tense, as if to put them in the past would make more real the loss and ache inside of me. And even now, the use of present tense to describe my grandfather still feels appropriate. It is because of the impact he has had and continues to have on my life. It is his generosity and encouragement that made it possible for me to attend graduate school. It is his voice I hear when I'm working on difficult stories, thinking about conflict and the things that matter to me most. And it is this example of thoughtfulness and compassion, his innate pragmatism, balanced with the belief that people can do genuine good, that I always hope to emulate. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Marion Engelman Monk. I met Alan in 1941. I was 5 years old and about to enter kindergarten. We had been living in Miami Beach, Florida, for about 2 years, where my parents had a grocery store on Washington Avenue, not far from the ocean. I was always worried the Germans were going to invade. To my knowledge, they never did. But hundreds of Portuguese men of war jellyfish took out their wrath on us instead. My parents were immigrants from Belarus and Poland, and the language spoken at home was Yiddish. My father longed to live on a farm, and then, as was the custom at the time, he was sent by mutual friends who lived in New York City to Toms River, New Jersey, where they had other immigrant friends on a chicken farm. We didn't know these people personally, but they took us in, and after some time, we found a place to farm and bought it. The friends were the Kassofs. They had a son, Alan, who was 11, a daughter, Rhoda, 15, and I had a brother, Carl, who was almost 9. We all became fast friends and lived about 2 miles apart. That was walking distance in those days. Thus started an 80-year friendship between us. Alan was really bright, funny, and kind. At times he was outrageous, and he always loved stirring the pot ever since I met him. He was inventive, he was curious and resourceful and intelligent, and kept life interesting and fun, seriously fun. This was a rather large group of Jewish chicken farmers, several hundred first-time farmers who had to figure everything out in groups or on their own. How to feed, house, and care for 10 to 20,000 birds, deal with sickness, buy feed cooperatively, clean, weigh, and sell eggs to the New York market, solve dozens of problems that they had never experienced in their lives before. The children, especially the boys, had to participate in the work, which was not always very enjoyable. There were constant meetings and discussions to solve all sorts of problems. Alan, in particular, always tried to make the work fun. One terrific example was alluded to before, was feeding the birds during the summer out on the range. We lived fairly close to Lakehurst Naval Air Station, and often the blimps would fly over, just skimming the trees. Most farmers had open back trucks where the feed was loaded in 50 and 100-pound bags. Hernias were common. Anyone who was at least 10 years old could drive those trucks around the farm, and farmers' children always were eligible for their licenses a year earlier than the general population. The bags would be opened sufficiently to let the feed drop as one person drove and another was on the back of the truck directing the contents of the bag. As feed dropped, the chickens would follow and line up to eat. I remember once when Alan was driving and the airmen were flying very close, one could see their faces while Alan spelled out FU to the airmen. His truck calligraphy was impeccable. He was always as outrageous as possible, joke teller and tease, but always kind. He could outtalk anyone and mostly did. He was a debater for as long as I can remember. But one day he met his match when he wanted to take my brother on a bicycle ride to Waretown, which was 15 miles down Route 9. My mother was not one to be trifled with. And when she said no, he could stand on his head, but no was no. His debating skills improved with age and experience, and is a large part of what made him so successful in his professional life. He became seriously interested in photography and printing. He set up a darkroom. He created equipment because we didn't have access to those things, and was really self-taught. Without him, I would have had very little documentation of my early life. When I needed good prints recently to publicize the Delaware Raritan Canal Watch, he never said no and made us a beautiful set of prints. Alan was a wonderful photographer and produced serious work. Typically for him, he wanted to brew a batch of root beer. We gathered old bottles from Coke and Pepsi and anything that came in a suitable shape. He did the research, we bottled it, working in the basement of the chicken's feed house. And I wish I could remember how long it took, but all the bottles exploded about the same time, and it was a wreck. I guess we cleaned up. Nobody seemed to discourage him from any project he started. He was always very much supported by his family and friends. I know there's a little bit more here. Oh, this is important. Whenever I needed help or advice, he was always there for me, and very often the first person I would go to. I sorely miss him and will continue to miss him. There are dozens of stories like those above, but this gives you a taste of my friend Alan's life.
I'm son-in-law Tom Hastings, standing in today for absent friends from Tom's River. Eric Lieber was a boyhood and then a lifelong friend of Alan's, and he has sent these remarks from California. Alan and I grew up together, Jewish chicken farmers' children, rapidly becoming best friends, Cass and Lieb, throughout grammar, high school, and one college year. Summer times we were together almost daily to have many adventures, the usual boyish ones, and cherished memory of swimming in the brown-watered creek. Often going around the first bend where there was a small sunlit beach of fine sand, perfect to mix with creek water as we dribbled moats, walls, bridges, turrets, and towers of countless palaces, rarely speaking as time turned into creek sparkles. And we often did school projects together. Here's Alan. We gathered at your house to do our required Shakespeare homework project for Mrs. Force. We did photos illustrating the line, "The quality of mercy is not strained," a creative but completely irrelevant effort that involved making photos of water passing through or missing a kitchen strainer. We did not get very good grades. Alan again. All I remember of several overnights in my house is that we pulled the bedroom shades down, then hurled knotted up underwear at them to laugh hysterically when they snapped up. Come college, and we roomed together in the Jewish house at Rutgers our first year, until I transferred to Antioch next year, leaving the still shining memory of him wincing when I told him, and after a brief, highly charged silence, saying, "I love you, love us." After my sextuple bypass surgery and near death, Alan said, "Delighted that you are still with us and more or less upright. You cannot leave, since that would remove one of the building blocks of my universe." And what a universe that was and still is. Hundreds, nay thousands, of lives lovingly touched. And though there are decades since Alan and I spent time together, he remains alive in my heart soul, as he does in yours, lovingly caring for us now as he cared for so very, very many, a man among men.
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel. I was Big Al's grandson. I'm here today reading words from longtime family friends, Eduardo and Miguel Schmid, who are now in Spain, but spent a lot of time in Princeton growing up. So here goes. It's hard to put into words what Alan meant to us. When we first met him as kids, he just happened to be Anita's dad and our parents' friend, another grown-up, if a particularly jovial one, from across the street at Makash Circle. When we last saw him, we had become more than friends. Over the years, he was a mentor and a sponsor, but also, despite the generational gap, a pal with whom to kick back, enjoy a meal or drinks, and trade off-color jokes. And boy, was he never short on those. If we had to choose the single quality of his that most struck us, besides his intellectual brilliance and perennial good cheer, we would say it was his people skills, and more specifically, his impulse to include. It didn't hurt that he was a supreme conversationalist. As if following a deep-seated herding instinct, this drive to bring people together, which perhaps underlay much of his professional career, played out in our lives in his visits to Spain, darkening our doorstep, as he used to tease. And when he hosted us at his home at Mercer Road and at the extravagant mansion he rented on the Jersey Shore, where the whole Kassof family would congregate on summers. As if such encounters were too few and far between to his liking, Alan also wanted to bring us into the overall conversation of American culture and politics. We still hold a subscription to the New York Review of Books, which he gifted us more than 10 years ago. Every new issue that arrives in our mailbox is a testament to his enduring kindness and generosity. In sum, Alan wanted us to be part of his life and made sure that we were. For this, we will always be grateful. And yet, how could we neglect mentioning another of his many charms, namely his penchant for the absurd? Following a distinguished career, which included teaching at Princeton, spearheading IREX, and rubbing elbows with European political leaders at PER, we remember him musing about prospective employment he could find in Spain upon retirement. His admiration for the large steel sculptures exposed to the elements in the grounds of the Chillida Leku Museum near San Sebastian had him pondering if he could perhaps do a stint there as a sculpture spritzer to maintain their rusty coating in the absence of rain. Although it's unclear how that could be compatible with his other dream job, which consisted in stuffing pitted olives with anchovies, one of his favorite treats whenever he visited. Despite his genuine love of flamenco, he never contemplated becoming a dancer because, in the words of an old TV commercial he loved to quote, "There's a better way to kill roaches." Still, there was nothing frivolous about Alan's wit, but rather a peculiar kind of wisdom to it. Far from acrimoniously denouncing the ways of the world, Alan appeared to embrace and almost celebrate its fickleness, which so often makes our best laid plans go astray, while striving to improve the lot of his fellow human beings. He seemed able to take everything in stride, as if human nature and its foibles never ceased to amuse him. Yes, he could bristle at the stupidity and malice of those in power, but he had a soft spot for the well-meaning klutz. By refusing to lend too much weight to life's ups and downs, to our assorted mishaps and blunders, he embodied a balanced and well-grounded perspective that saw the comedy in small tragedies. To us, his unflappable and sympathetic attitude conveyed not just confidence in his own resourcefulness, but a trust in the potential goodness of life and a surplus of well-being he gladly shared with others, uplifting everyone in the process. Alan afforded us a second family and home in the States, and epitomized all that's engaging, enjoyable, and dear to us about America. We miss him sorely.
Hello, I'm Carly Rogers. I worked with Alan from 1969 to 1986 at the International Research and Exchanges Board. And I got to witness his transformation of the way the exchanges were administered. The predecessor organization that administered the academic exchanges with the Soviet Union from 1958 to 1968 was run out of Indiana University and headed by a Professor Robert Burns, whose letters always ended, and we are dismayed with the way you don't manage these programs. There's no way to run a railroad. And he never, his letters were awful. So when Alan took over, his letters were impeccable. The diplomatic language was superb. And he had always a large staff, mostly of women, and took us all to the academic conferences, which was breaking the mold at the time. And at one hotel, I remember at some Slavic conference, the man was looking at us, some businessman, what airlines are these girls from? You just could not believe we were in any way professional. So in any way, Alan, to get an idea of how he operated with the Soviet Union, we traveled many times. And so I will tell you about one trip. We used to go to Western Europe and spend one night there so as to arrive somewhat awake in case there was a crisis in Moscow. And one year he said, where haven't we been? I think it was 1974. We haven't been to Dublin. Let's try Dublin. So we're sitting in the airport at Kennedy, and a colleague goes to call his wife, and she says, did you know this bombs just went off in Dublin? So we said, oh, well, they've been off, so we might as well keep going. So we arrived in Dublin, and it was very quiet. There's cordite all over the place, you know, it was post-car bombs, very scary. And suddenly we discovered that the British Airway went on strike, and we were taking off the next day, and we got the last seats on Aer Lingus, and we arrived 20 minutes later than our schedule. There was going to be 1 hour layover to make our Aeroflot flight to Moscow. And we're held on the tarmac in this airplane with shamrocks all over it. And the stewardess says, a bomb's just gone off in Terminal 1. Oh, okay. So he called Rhoda, his sister in Zurich. She helped him arrange a hotel. We got the last tickets possible on Swiss Air, arrived in Moscow a day late, with snow, end of May, never mind. All right, that was the kind of travel we sometimes experienced. Then there would be the meetings with the Ministry of Higher Education. And there was one time we had what we called the 7-hour lunch. We had arrived at the ministry and expected a business meeting, and it went on for about 45 minutes. And the ministry people said, well, we've really done our business. We have to leave now. We want to take you to lunch, but at the inn is sort of outside Moscow. So we get in these black limos and we go through this forest. We wonder, are we being abducted? Well, we end up in this little Russian hut, rural kind of inn. And it was mainly vodka. So we ended up getting up and walking outside during the lunch to sort of keep our heads straight. And at one point, Alan is exchanging ties with the head of the Foreign Relations Department of the ministry, saying, we can accept all the scholars. Yes, all 30. Yes, 30. So Alan gives this beautiful, expensive tie and gets a rather sleazy one from Bajanov, you know, but never mind, it worked. And the thing that I found most impressive was as the years went on, he created with his colleague Dan Matuszewski something called the USSR Commission on Social Sciences and Humanities with the Academy of Sciences. And this was a very creative structure for cooperative work. And there were subcommissions on various topics. The history didn't go so well because you can't write a history of Lenin without offending the official historians of the Soviet Union. But the people who did the anthropological longevity studies became very close colleagues. So it was over the years, from being adversarial, it became collegial. And I wish the wisdom that was acquired by the people who participated in this commission were influencing the right people these days. And Alan's capacity for good-natured diplomacy in meetings, no matter what scathing remarks he might have made about Soviet colleagues otherwise when they weren't there, but he was impeccable in his diplomacy. And I learned a great deal from him, and I think the country, we gained a great deal from those exchanges. Thank you.
My name is Alex Aronishvili-Grigoriev, and I am the president of the Council for Inclusive Governance, the successor organization to the project on ethnic relations that Alan Kassof founded in 1991. I worked with Alan at PER for 14 years, worked with him on few projects as late as 2019, after PER closed its doors. He was my mentor, a friend for 26 years. Big Al loved giving people nicknames. Mine was Little Al. Annie, Arlen, Anita, your father was a voice of wisdom, intelligence, passion, patience, persistence, tolerance, unending belief in humanity, empathy, a terrific sense of humor and storytelling, and always, always, always common sense. With all these extraordinary qualities, he has made some notable differences in the lives of so many people, many communities, and many countries. He was too humble to acknowledge that and cautioned others from doing so, but Alan Kassof did contribute to making history. When others worked on destruction, he worked on putting it all together. When others emphasized differences and division, he searched for common interest and reconciliation. When others focused on the past, he encouraged them to focus on their own future. And in the end, he did that with grace, without lecturing, without moralizing, most often by asking simple key questions. His favorite was after he would finish listening to all their kvetching, he will say, well, you know, when this is all said and done, what kind of country do we want to live in? He believed that all politics in the end is personal. Personal relations are key. And he worked hard on helping others establish those relations, very often after a bloody conflict. He taught others how to learn to trust one another, and the others trusted him. Alan Kassof believed that when trust is present, good things happen. This was his simple but a very insightful recipe, and he implemented that recipe through dialogue. At the turn of the century, I believe interethnic dialogue has not had a better champion than Alan Kassof. He presided over many negotiations, mediated ethnic conflict in Europe. He was intensely involved in establishment of multi-ethnic governance in Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Bulgaria. And in all that work, he was humble. Once he compared our work to a souffle, and he said that it looks great when you take it out of the oven, but in 10 minutes, it goes kalush. And the only thing you see is a thin layer of what is left. He was adamant that there is no such thing as a theory or science of conflict resolution, and he considered such thing preposterous, silly, absurd. He was vividly upset and annoyed by attempts to quantify conflict resolution efforts. He used to say that one learns more from talking to the fish and from the fish talking back to you than from studying and reading about the fish? His answer was common sense, diplomacy, regional and country knowledge, knowledge of history, languages, persistent and patient frequent contact, personal relations, and trust. He often said while hiring staff, all I need is a smart graduate with all those skills, concrete skills. He was so sorry to see regional and country studies largely disappear from American universities and the declining attention to foreign languages. He had a very strong grasp of what was possible. Allen did not subscribe to the cliches about erasing differences. He understood differences persist and largely rarely disappear, but he taught people how to learn to live together while still keeping their differences, but living in peace. A wise and thoughtful man, he made us proud to work with him, and it was an honor to be associated every step of the way with Alan Kassof. His advice was sought by presidents and prime ministers, but he never forgot who he was and where he came from. The chicken farm from Toms River, New Jersey, was always present in the conversations with those big shots. To contrast the complicated ideas, elaborate thoughts, he often repeated the simple truth. He said that, if you don't feed the chickens, they die, no matter what kind of fancy ideas you have. And I think that made him a pragmatist. And of course, he often, in those conversations with the big shots and not so big shots, he employed the help of multiple fictional characters from his favorite jokes. Who can forget Marcus Pincus? Or the German and Austrian policemen, or the Pope commenting on the New Jersey haircut, the presenters of Radio Yerevan, and of course, Sulio Muyo from Bosnia. I cannot speak about Alan without mentioning that lady behind me. They were a terrific pair, Alan and Ariane. Their tremendous hospitality has been enjoyed by so many around the world. Their home was always open at good times and bad times. After a bad car accident here in Princeton 25 years ago, it was Alan and Ariane who basically ordered me to stay at their home that night. It didn't let me to be alone at my own house. It's hard to see him gone, and I wish he was still here to share his wisdom on a facilitation matter or present his take on the world events. He does remain in our heart, in our minds, memories, and our work, and is simply because the issues that Alan Kassof had worked on, they are not gone. They will remain, unfortunately, a never-ending part of the human experience, and probably will never disappear. And we will honor him by continuing our work, showing empathy for others, promoting and advancing dialogue and interethnic accord, and simply by asking common sense questions. A humble man, he respected people, and people respected him in return. They cherished his wisdom and advice. And this is how I want and remember Alan Kassof, surrounded by friends and admirers who were trying to catch every single word of his. There's one thing I would like to say also at the end, with the permission of the family. Allow me to take a few more minutes of your time to pass on a few sentiments from some people from around the world. So many with whom Alan had worked over the years in so many countries asked me to convey their deepest condolences to his family and friends. And so many wanted to be here but could not. And quite a few wrote letters of tribute, which I have with me, will pass to the family, 28 of them. And I'm truly honored to pass them to the family. These letters would give you a much better idea of what your father and grandfather meant to so many people around the world. These letters come with a lot of personal sentiment, stories, and I have to say, because quite a few of them are watching, their names, so bear with me. They come from the former Deputy Prime Minister of Macedonia, Teuta Arifi. She's also now Mayor of Tetovo. Professor from Bologna, Italy, Stefano Bianchini. Former Minister in the government of Romania, Laszlo Borbély. Member of the Per Council for Ethnic Accord and Professor in Brandeis University, Stephen Berg. Former US Assistant Secretary of State, Thomas Countryman. Current Ambassador of Kosovo to the United States, Ilir Dugoli. Former Ambassador of Switzerland to Kosovo, Sweden, and Albania, Ivana Ensler. Current US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and former intern at PER, Barbara Feinstein, Mayor of Jakova and former Minister in the government of Kosovo, Ardian Gini, former Secretary General of New Democracy Party in Serbia, Tahir Hasanovic, former Deputy Prime Minister of Kosovo, Lutfi Haziri, former Kosovo Foreign Minister, Skender Husseini, President of the Roundtable on Ethnic Relations in Romania, Vladimir Jonas, member of PERS Council for Ethnic Accord and President of the Forum for Ethnic Relations in Serbia, Dusan Janic, President of the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence, also in Serbia, Sonja Licht, former Director of the PER office in Kosovo and also former Ambassador of Kosovo to Japan, Leon Malazogu, the last Speaker of the Yugoslav Federal Parliament, Dragoljub Mićunović, former Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia and Minister of Police, Dusan Mihajlović, former American Ambassador to Serbia and Pakistan, Cameron Munter, former owner of the Miros Travel Agency in Serbia, who organized Alan's travels in Serbia, Mirjana Nenadić, the interpreter from Serbia, who interpreted for Alan, Biljana Obradović, former Deputy Prime Minister of Albania against Polo, former member of the Kosovo Parliament and one of the leaders of the Kosovo Serb minority community, Nenad Radosavljević, former Foreign Minister of Montenegro, Milan Rocin, head of peace policy in the Swiss Foreign Ministry, Roland Saldisberg, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of Macedonia, Radmila Šekerinska, former Deputy Prime Minister of Kosovo, Edita Tahiri, and former Member of Parliament of Serbia, Nataša Vučković. I know our time is limited, but I cannot possibly read the list of all of them without sharing just half a page of few key characteristic quotes to underline what Alan meant for this long list of people, just as long as your scroll. The authors call Alan, in their own words, a great friend, colleague, advisor, teacher, a warm, caring, and concerned father figure, a role model, a wonderful person, a gentleman, a wise man, an impartial diplomat, a smart intellectual, the most effective nonpartisan mediator of ethnic conflict, a person with a heart who very much believed in what he was doing. Quotes, Alan understood people, what made them tick. He listened with a voracious appetite, carefully and respectfully, cultivating their trust, making them feel that they were the only ones in that room. His sterling reputation preceded him, but getting to know him personally exceeded my expectations. Knowing him made me a better person. I have learned many vital lessons from Alan. We call them the Kassof principles of dialogue. Alan contributed to the change in the attitude of the secret police towards me. Alan Kassof helped to prolong my life. While most people want to earn respect for themselves, Alan Kassof struggled to make others respect one another. It's no surprise he won the respect of all the people he worked with. Alan had a power to raise hopes for peace among those who have lost such hope a long time ago. Alan Kassof remains part of our history, our collective present, but at the same time, part of our country's future.
My name is Samuel Abraham. I come from Slovakia, and I'm honored to be at this memorial service. Dear Arlen, Annie, and Anita, dear family and friends of Alan Kassof, every journey starts and ends. Departure of a close one is painful for family and friends, but eventually what matters is what is left. The memory and legacy for us and others on our journey from the people who have already departed. Alan's legacy prevails in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Kosovo. Legacy among people who were able to breach their ethnic ghetto, and also thanks to meeting him. Alan and I met thanks to Martin Butora in 1996, just as I arrived back to Slovakia from my exile in Canada. We shared being outsiders, the outsiders who truly cared. People often ask me, why did you return? I'm sure many who first met Alan thought, why is this American professor here? Well, after his many returns, those who knew him might not have still understood his motivation, but they knew that Alan was not an American who comes, tries to solve all the problems of democracy and leave. Alan and Livia Plax with whom we founded Project on Ethnic Relations, kept returning, kept inviting and connecting those who would never sit at the same table. I was lucky to be present at those conversations with Alan's colleague, serving also as an interpreter. I could closely observe his ability to initiate a dialogue, depict the problem, and offer the way forward. His sincerity, intelligence, always intermittent with humor, of course, but also a perfect knowledge of the context and background, gained confidence of almost every politician he encountered. The legacy he left in Slovakia is important, although distant and indirect. A turning point of our post-communist history was the year 1998, when we managed to defeat a populist and aspiring dictator, Vladimir Mečiar. Well, he barely lost the election, but mind you, at least he left peaceful and definitely. Now, before 1998, Alan and Livia Plax organized many meetings among Hungarian and Slovak politicians, journalists, and intellectuals. Among people who would not meet otherwise, certainly not debating substantial issues. They were split as Slovaks and Hungarians, and they were split internally. Actually, they perfectly confirm one of Alan's 6 memorable rules of ethnic conflict. In every inter-ethnic conflict, there are at least 4 sides. After Mečiar was defeated in 1998, it was a great shock to many that these Slovak and Hungarian parties quickly reached an agreement and created a coalition. Many of us are convinced that without those debates organized by PER, these parties would hardly create a coalition in 1998. That is Alan's legacy in Slovakia. On a personal note, my friendship with Alan evolved. Rather than being made in 1990s when I worked with him and then being kept in contact since. With Alan, we stayed in touch and in fact had become good friends gradually after we worked together. I visited him often in Princeton, met his wife Ariane, and later his close companions, including Trudy. He came a couple of times to Bratislava, usually on his way to Romania. He knows my wife Darina well. He knew our children, and the picture he did of us, sometimes in 1999, still hangs in our apartment. Now, something that defines Alan himself, something I recall with fondness. At the 20th anniversary of my journal, Critica in Context, I invited several friends and past contributors to select a text that had an impact on them and also ask them to introduce their text in their own words. First, Alan chose Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, but changed his mind. Alan chose an excerpt from an English traveler, Hugh Lake Fermor, who traveled as a young man through Central Europe in the late 20s. It was Fermor's description of Transylvania in the 20s, now in Romania with the large ethnic Hungarian population, the same Transylvania where the journey of Per started in 1991. In his introduction, Alan wrote, "I did not discover Fermor's account until 2010, so it had nothing to do with my intellectual formation. Yet it has had an important retrospective and confirmatory effect on how I came to understand my own much later experiences in the region that Fermor describes." And Alan ends this text from 2016 with these words. "Events in Europe, and now even in America, show us how easy it is to separate the family of man into tribes. How sweet it is to be reminded of Fermor's about the street-level decency of a time still within our memory." Well, this sounds nostalgic, but Alan insisted on practical solution and tried to include street-level decency on politicians who were in conflict because they were from different tribes. He succeeded with some, and his legacy, indirect and distant, has been important in several countries in Central and Southern Europe. As I said, what is left after those departed is their legacy. Alan left some funds to our school, and we used them to create a student scholarship at Wisla, bearing his name. I invited a number of his close friends in Slovakia to become members of the board that will select the winners. Katarina Križanová from Wisla has won the first scholarship already. I wish, maybe in cooperation with some of you, that scholarship would eventually reach young people in all those countries when Alan was active and helpful. To conclude, when I published in Slovakia an article about Alan last year, I started that article that many people knew Alan Kassof, but many people didn't know Alan Kassof, but in the 90s, the whole political leadership did. The young editor wrote to me, quote, "I'm sorry, I have not met Mr. Kassof." Well, Alan, we will try to preserve your legacy among young people who would meet you indirectly through a study topic you understood and cared for about very much.
Jerry Sprague, now pictured behind me, also grew up with Alan in Toms River, but they became dear friends later in life, and Jerry was among those with Alan when he died. Jerry has sent these remarks from Arizona. "Dear Big Al's gang, my very special second family with whom I shared that very sad but loving weekend of his passing. I thank you for including me then and today in this memorial service. Alan and I decided that we most likely first met back in September of 1941 in Miss Grover's sixth grade class in Toms River Elementary School. While we never became friends at that time, we did share the same classmates, the same ambiance, and the same hormonal angst as we began lurching into puberty, and of course, the burgeoning disaster of World War II. We both, along with many of our classmates, realized instinctively that dear Miss Grover was the best possible teacher for us to have at this germinal point in our young lives. Alan often spoke of how fortunate we were to have attended not only such an enlightened school, but to have had such a kind and intelligent teacher to guide us. Years later, we realized how blessed we had been. So Alan and I trundled along through our school years, mostly unaware of one another. He, an excellent student and a nerdy techie whose senior picture blurb says, "Mad scientist, new ideas, ready to argue, able speaker." And I, a mediocre student and jock, wondering so naively which Major League Baseball team would draft me. Jump ahead 40 years to 1988, when I was living and working in Honolulu. That summer, I happened to visit my parents in Toms River and learned there was to be a reunion of the class of 1948. Having never attended one before, I thought it time to get reacquainted with classmates and those wonderfully innocent times. Alan happened to be the MC that night at the Captain's Inn in Forked River, and at some serendipitous point during the evening, we got talking and seemed to immediately become fast friends. It was an amazing moment and one I shall always treasure. During the next few years, Alan and Ariane came to Hawaii twice on business with Per, and we enjoyed touring and dining together. And whenever I visited my parents, I was always invited to spend a few days in Princeton. It was sometime after I retired to New Orleans, at the start of 2003, that Alan asked me if I would like to do a cross-country auto trip with him from Princeton to Annie's home in Berkeley. Completely unstructured, doing whatever pleased us at the moment. Of course, I jumped at the idea. We remembered well our first evening on the road when we stopped at a motel in the Catskills that Alan had selected from a travel guide. It was late afternoon when we pulled into the crowded front of the lodging, and I immediately said to Alan that he managed to pick a gay motel. He wondered how I could tell just from the outside, and I said, look at the decor, the signage, the color scheme, all very professional, clean, and inviting. With Alan still unbelieving, we entered and were greeted curiously by many 30 to 40-year-old male couples who nodded knowingly at our age and appearance. It wasn't until we asked for separate rooms that there was a brief flutter in the dovecote, and their interest in us rapidly disappeared. Such was the start of our first trip. Many days later, after visiting a friend of Alan's in Cooperstown and then another in Detroit, we traveled west, listening to a tape of the wonderful Irene Nemirovsky's Suite Française and frequenting small museums wherever we found them. But the real beauty and meaning of the journey for me was in learning the depth of Alan's humanity, his gleeful sense of humor, and his talent for making strangers feel so welcome. At one motel in the Midwest, Alan had gone down to breakfast before me, and when I entered the breakfast area, he had this middle-aged fellow creating balloon animals for every guest who came in. When I questioned Alan, he told me that the man had a very sick granddaughter, and to help take her mind off her illness, he had taught himself to make balloon figures. So here was this gentleman with a tear in his eye for his ailing granddaughter, obviously pleased to be beaming at Alan, who beamed back, pleased at his own creation of that lovely moment. On our second cross-country trip a year or two later, it was the same. Everyone Alan encountered, whether old ladies in museums, pretty ladies in restaurants, or men of all ages everywhere, each warmed to his aura of friendliness and understanding. I became the admiring supernumerary, basking in the glow of his personality, and I loved it. For the second trip, we decided to explore the Bible Belt, possibly because it was such an alien concept for us that it made a valid reason for exploration. After first visiting with Anita, Josh, and the kids in Baltimore, we started across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Alan became fascinated not only with the number of churches, but also for their neon signs, each promising the true way to heaven. He started photographing every sign we came to, but soon realized it was an exercise in futility because of the sheer volume. It did lead him to create the first line of a joke that began, "A Jewish chicken farmer and an atheist walked into a Southern Baptist church." Then on, we went to Nashville and the Grand Ole Opry, to Graceland, I believe, and across southern Texas and into the Rio Grande Valley, where we followed the reverse path of Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, the film which we saw together in El Paso at the conclusion of our trip. How odd to end such a lovely journey with that darkest of characters. 2 trips over many days with such a dear companion. How fortunate I was, and how fortunate to have had him as my very close friend for the last 33 years, all because I happened to be in town for that 40th reunion. Upon such fragile moments. Though I miss Alan every day, I do find it easy to conjure his face, his voice, and the gleeful animation of his delight in the pleasures and vagaries of life.
Hello, my name is Bruce Wilsey, and my wife and I were neighbors of Alan's for many years. How does one choose words to remember someone who is a master of words? Alan was our neighbor for 16 years and Ariane for almost as long. He was a frequent dinner companion, a brilliant conversationalist, a host, raconteur, scholar, wise commentator on international affairs, and a man who in significant ways changed the world and the lives of countless people in Romania in particular through his diplomatic skills. Words were a defining characteristic of the man. On more than one occasion over meals at our home, I've seen Alan draw shy dinner guests into conversations that honored them and integrated them into the group, regardless of their background, social skills, or education. I've heard him offer kind but pithy rebuttals to offensive comments made by others, and have seen him cut through the miasma of imprecise language, clarifying and focusing on the issue truly at hand. All of us have stories, but Alan's were special. Built on decades of traveling and working in international relations, his stories enlightened, amused, and left listeners with a deeper understanding of the world. Now, the conversations were not always serious, and all of us here today have been witness to Alan's silly side. The rabbit ears, the tales of youthful practical jokes, and the calendars of questionable taste. You know what I'm talking about. He was also a man who appreciated gadgets, including his espresso maker, computer, and television remote control. Generous with his time and with his home, he offered Marcia, my wife, and me countless casual evenings in his living room, pre-gaming dinner with tuna stuffed olives, cheese, and wine. We miss those evenings dearly. A good neighbor is one with whom you can chat over a fence. A great neighbor is one on whom you can count for help, and Alan was one of these. When we were away, he would keep tabs on our house and gather the eggs from our chickens. When my wife's home business faced a licensing issue, he took the time to speak publicly at the hearing, swaying opinions with his eloquent testimony. For friends, he would travel great distances and emotional miles. For family, he was the pillar supporting them and believing in their futures. Still, Alan hated hagiography, so I'll offer a criticism as well. He left us too soon, and with too many words still to be said. In the end, I settle on two simple words to describe Alan: good friend. Good friend, we will miss your thoughtful and fascinating conversation, your kind verbal interventions in awkward situations, and most of all, your long narrative jokes nearly always ending in a reference to a chicken. You live on, whether you know it or not, in the lives of the many people you helped and the memories of the friends that you made. Do svidania, Alan. Goodbye.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Isaac. I'm Alan's nephew by his sister Rhoda, this is Sophie, my wife, Elias, my son. And I want to say just a couple of words about how central and important Alan was to, I can't remember, to his extended family. I'm not used to speaking at funerals, memorials, weddings, etc. Alan was always right and delivered wonderful speeches for all family ceremonies, weddings, bar mitzvahs, you name it, christenings. I remember his speaking at the funeral of my grandfather, his father Mersch, his mother Soph, my brother Jan, my father Henry, and many others. He didn't speak at my mother's funeral, his sister's, because she outlived him by a couple of months. He was the speech giver, the general master of ceremonies at all family gatherings, often hosted by himself and Mary Ann. He happily accepted the role of patriarch, pater familias. He would keep track of the goings on of the extended family with concern, care, and only occasional unnecessary mention. We all counted on him for advice, for guidance, for his opinion and his support. And as you all know from experience, with bad jokes, his hospitality and his affection. He was unique, and he will, there's no one will ever take his place. I can imagine. Anybody else have anything to say? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm Anita, Alan and Ariane's youngest. Thank you all for being here. It means a great deal to Annie, Arlen, and me and the entire family. As we've heard, my father had a joke for every occasion, usually dirty, often offensive, always flawlessly delivered. So in his honor, I'd like to open with one of his jokes. It goes like this. 2 muffins are sitting in an oven. One muffin turns to the other and says, "Gee, it's getting hot in here." And the second muffin says, "Would you look at that, a talking muffin?" It's okay if you didn't laugh. Not because this is a solemn occasion, but because unlike most of my father's jokes, this one isn't funny. So why, without fail, did I nonetheless fall into side-splitting paroxysms of laughter every single time my father told that joke? Perhaps unsurprisingly, it had nothing to do with the joke itself and everything to do with who was telling it. Turns out, people are more likely to laugh at jokes, even unfunny ones like the muffin joke, if they're told by people they look up to. And I revered my father, though I suspect it would have embarrassed him to hear me say it. He had his flaws like everyone else, but my respect for him was absolute. We shared a warm, easy, and uncomplicated affection. My father called himself a secular humanist, but he was as Jewish as they come in all the ways that matter most. He had a deep sense of responsibility for making the world a better place, an ironclad commitment to family, bottomless reserves of warmth, profound respect for intellectual pursuits, an ironic sense of humor, and impeccable comic timing. And he could mimic a Yiddish accent worthy of a shtetl rabbi. He was a great bestower of absurd nicknames on both objects and people. And of course, we lovingly reciprocated by dubbing him Big Al. The irony of the name, which evokes a beefy longshoreman or a mafia don, isn't lost on me, considering my father started life as a scrawny Jewish farm boy. In fact, he carried a little of that inner farm boy, whip smart, resourceful, mischievous, curious, and a little cocky in him all his life. Stories of his boyhood on the chicken farm form the soundtrack of my own childhood. In Princeton, my father was the neighborhood expert when the raise your own chicken phase hit in the early 2000s. My mother, an enthusiastic accomplice, filled our house with all manner of chicken tchotchkes. My father credited his childhood working on the farm with the pragmatism that later guided his international negotiations when he headed IREX and PER. But lots of people are pragmatic. What made my father so extraordinary and what distinguished him as a mediator of ethnic conflict was how he tempered that pragmatism with the profound empathy that he brought to every interaction, professional or personal. As a child, I didn't fully understand what my father did for a living, but I knew it was something special and complicated and wonderful, and that it set him apart from the other kids' dads whose jobs could be described by single words. While other families were headed to Disneyland for vacation, the Kassof family set off on a driving tour of Eastern Europe. It was formative for all of us as kids. My father might have had a front row seat on the Cold War, but Annie, Arlen, and I saw plenty from the back seat. I think each daughter suspects to this day that we were our father's favorite. And I don't think any of us is wrong. He loved each of us fiercely and uniquely. He was a devoted and enthusiastic grandfather and uncle, and he served as a kind of an auxiliary father for a whole generation of young men and women. Regula, the Bader kids, Eduardo and Miguel Schmidt, and numerous younger colleagues. Many of them had perfectly fine fathers of their own, but I suspect they appreciated that while my father was wise, he didn't dispense unsolicited advice, nor did he offer hollow praise. If he said you'd done something well, it was the very highest compliment because you knew he meant it. One of the things that most delighted us all was what lay just below that worldly exterior. He could prevail on the world stage, offer sophisticated analysis of international affairs or current events, and comment insightfully on art or literature. Yet he was also just plain adorable. His wraparound sunglasses, worn on a chain around his neck, became a receptacle, an after-the-fact record of what he had just eaten for lunch. He wore shorts and suspenders. Every time he sliced a banana onto his cereal, he burst into song, channeling Louis Prima and bellowing out a verse of, "Yes, we have no bananas." And he was never, ever without a chapstick in his pocket. After my father died, I discovered and read his love letters to my mom, written when he was a budding academic drawn to the then exotic field of Soviet studies. His letters and hers to him described the future they envisioned. For the most part, they built that life, though he deviated a bit when he left the university to pursue an international career. My mother, who'd imagined life as a faculty wife and a member of the university community, kept the home fires burning while he traveled the world. In the end, though, my dad came back and embraced the home my mom had worked so hard to build. When others downsized, he dug in, the better to have a big house to accommodate visitors from all over the world. He was a loving and patient caregiver to my mom in her last months. I think he was glad finally to have a way to be able to demonstrate to her just how much he adored her. He was generous in his affections, and he loved sharing the nest egg they had built up through a lifetime of hard work and frugality. He delighted in having the means to bring family together, subsidizing tickets for cross-country or transatlantic travel to see far-flung relatives, and renting a house on Long Beach Island where the extended family gathered every summer for nearly a quarter of a century. He had a magnificent second act with Trudy, who slipped seamlessly and lovingly into his life and ours. There was no drama or baggage between them, just pure, unadulterated joy. They holed up happily together during COVID and were just beginning to reemerge when she died. He never quite recovered from the shock of her loss, dying 6 months to the day, almost to the minute after we lost her. He always did have a sentimental, romantic streak. When we're little, we think our parents dropped onto the earth fully formed and omniscient. I'm not sure I ever outgrew that with my father. He seemed to know everything, most of all how to live life right, down to the last months of physical decline when he stubbornly insisted on staying in the house he loved, investing in stair lifts and custom beds, and placing daily Amazon orders for all manner of medical doohickeys. In the end, he prevailed and he was right. Those final bittersweet days when he held court on his hospital bed in the living room, drifting in and out of consciousness, were as much a celebration of life as a dreaded farewell. Until the moment he slipped away, our father remained the family's center of gravity. I'm not sure where we go next, now that the family has been thrown off its axis by his departure. We're still finding our way. But my father always said he wanted a party when he died. He wouldn't want us to be mournful. So let's temper our grief with glorious memories of him as we honor a life well lived.